Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to The Cove, the home of the Australian profession of arms. You're joining us as we broadcast here live from Adelaide, home of significant elements of the 1st Brigade, and we'll be talking to you about the future of war here on CoveTalk.
So if you think about ISIS at its high point, it held 110,000 square kilometers. It's gone now, so they hold nothing terrain-wise. So that is a huge piece. They held Raqqa, Dar Zor, they held Mosul, Ramadi, Fallujah. So they held a lot of key terrain in both Iraq and Syria. And now, they hold nothing. ISIS has been a problem for years. So the fact that we're, eradicating the last real physical remnant of the caliphate is it's a huge deal for everybody. Huge deal for the SDF, huge deal for Iraq, huge deal for the world. ISIS, or Daesh, as a lot of Arabic speakers call them, they're the worst kind of force out there. They're brutal, inhuman, torturing. They've been a scourge on the landscape. But they're also a capable force that gave our partners and us some trouble, and I'm glad that over the years we've managed to push them back and defeat them. Basically, this represents the end of ISIS's physical presence, which is a great thing. Remember, this isn't the end. There are clandestine networks and cells out there that are still operating. There's an enduring defeat piece, but taking away the last bit of their physical terrain, huge deal. So in regards to the future, I'm hopeful. I think that this is a big turning point for both Syria, for the SDF, for Northeast Syria, and for Iraq, and hopefully for the world.
That video was released this week on Monday by the Special Operations Force from Operation Inherent Resolve. And the President of the United States, Donald Trump, announced that ISIS, or Islamic State, had been territorially defeated in Syria and Iraq. Well, we were due to have with us today Dr. David Matthews, a world expert on Islamic State from the Defense Science and Technology Group. Sadly, for reasons beyond his control and ours here at the Cove team, at the last minute he couldn't make it. But we're going to ask today, what is the future of war and how do we win the next war? And I'll be giving that presentation to you here today. So how do we win the next war? This is a question that should keep us all up at night. This is the question which, regardless of rank, regardless of corps, regardless of your current occupation, should define our thinking as professional soldiers within the military. And I'm going to take us on a quick journey. We're going to go back a little bit, and we're going to look at how have we won wars previously. What are the factors that have played a significant part in winning previous wars? So this picture here, this is a famous picture of the Battle of Rorke's Drift. At this battle, just over 100 soldiers from B Company, the 24th Regiment of Foot, held off around about 4,000 to 5,000 Zulus over a period of about 48 hours. How did they do it? Really, although there was a lot of courage and a lot of hand-to-hand fighting, they did it because they had technological superiority. The Martini Henry rifle was no match for the assegais and the cowhide shields of the Zulus. And it was that technological superiority that won that battle at Rorke's Drift. However, 24 hours earlier, soldiers from the same regiment, accompanied by native levies, around about 1,800 in total, were wiped out by a force of about 20 to 30,000 Zulus. So regardless of the technological superiority, and noting that this force in this battle at Isandlwana also had artillery, they had early rocket artillery, and they had cavalry, were defeated by mass. So if we look at it throughout history, and the reason I like these examples is these are two battles war with the same participants 24 hours apart from each other. Okay, so a lot of the variables that could happen if we looked at different wars in different periods of time, these are the same protagonists. So mass and technological superiority. And throughout other examples in history, we can see where that happened. For example, German tanks, on the whole, were technologically superior during the Second World War. But they were overwhelmed by mass-produced tanks of the American and Russian armies. And we see that throughout history. So how is Australia going to win the next war? How are we going to do that? Can we use mass or technological superiority? Well, in 1966, this was the Royal Australian Air Force's top fighter jet, the Sabre. It was technologically superior to anything else in the region when it came into service. Okay, it had a range of about 1,200 kilometers, a great climb rate, a great turn rate, etc. Okay, it was technologically superior. In 5 years, though, it was technologically obsolete and retired from the inventory of the Royal Australian Air Force. Coincidentally, in 1966 was the first year that the M113 came into service with the Australian Army, something which I know you all from 7RER are very familiar with. And this is the first thing about technological superiority. It goes on a sine wave. So when the M113 came into service, it was technologically superior to its peers in many, many ways. And that then comes down over time as other technological advances from our peers come into being, and it goes down. You will then get a midlife upgrade and it will bump up, but really you get this sine wave going down, and then we bring into service the next piece of equipment. So Land 400, Phase 3, will be right up at the top, technological superiority. But then, as other countries develop other armoured fighting vehicles or anti-armour weapons, etc., it will naturally tail off, and we understand that, we know that. And that's been happening ever since cavemen first picked up a rock and caved in another man's skull, and then someone said, well, I'll tell you what, if I sharpen this flint, that's more effective. And then someone said, well, if I put the sharpened flint on a stick, I'm outside of arm's reach, and I'll call it a spear. And so he was at the top. And then someone said, well, if I put it onto a shorter stick and use some twine, I can turn it into an arrow, and then I'm outside of his range. So we've seen it throughout the history of warfare. Okay? So we cannot take as a given that we will win the next war through technological superiority, because we don't know where we will be on that sine wave. Okay? Then there's mass. Okay, so you'll see up here on this chart here, highlighted is where Australia sits in the region for size of armies. Okay? Australia has never had a large standing army, and it never will have a large standing army. Okay? We at the moment have a combined total force of around about 45,000, 30,000 regulars and 15,000 reservists. Okay? Now this slide is actually a few years old. The Chinese army has gone through modernization, and since this has decreased in some areas but increased its force projection capabilities, including its Marines. Probably a better thing to look at is this slide here. Now this is an index done by the Lowy Institute, where they took over 200 different factors across economies, defense, etc., and worked out the link and came up with the Asian Diplomacy Index, and the Asian Power Index. And what you can see here, this is for defense. So this is how they have calculated, using an incredibly complex formula, but Australia's weight of defense relative to other countries in Asia. So you can see where we probably sit where it comes to mass. So we're not going to be able to rely on mass to win the next battle, and we're not going to be able to rely on technological superiority to win the next battle. So what can we use? Well, before I get on to that, I'm going to introduce you to something that I'm just going to call Colton's theory of relativity. Okay, so we don't have to have overall mass and technological superiority all the time, everywhere. All we need to do is to be able to, in time and space, create that superiority to have an effect relative to our adversary at that time. Okay? So if you can identify a weakness or a vulnerability in an enemy, And you can then, because you understand the environment, you understand your own forces, you can then bring your effects together to achieve that relative superiority for the period of time you need to have an effect. That may then disappear, but you've already had that effect and you look at the next place to do that. What do we need for that then? We need an intellectual edge. We need that cognitive capacity to be able to create that relative superiority. And we do that through improving the way that we think and the way that we make decisions. Right, because everything's founded in doctrine, this is found in LWD1, the Fundamentals of Land Warfare. Okay? And this slide says that this is how we generate fighting power in the land force. You'll see there's three components: physical component, the moral component, and there is also the intellectual component. Now, to break that down, physical component really is the things that we use, such as your vehicles, your weapons, the logistics that support them, the training that you get to be able to use those weapons and equipment, importantly, the sheds that you park the vehicles in. In essence, everything that the Army describes as a fundamental input to capability really is part of that physical component. So all the training you've just done out at Coltana, that's part of generating the physical component of fighting power. We then have the moral component of fighting power. That's your will to fight. So those are things such as ethos, trust in the organization, the fact that you're not going to let your mates down or your regiment down or your unit down. It's the reason that we wear symbols. It's the reason why we wear cat badges. It's the reason we're organized into corps, for example, which some people, well, there's an argument it may not be the most the most administratively easy way to do things, and it brings some issues with it, such as cat badge loyalty and core considerations, etc. What it does do is it reinforces that moral component of fighting power, which is people wanting to fight for the person next to them. Finally, then, there's the intellectual component of fighting power. That's the what to think. And I would add to this, which isn't in doctrine, it's also the how to think. So how do you outthink your adversary? How do you combine that knowledge of war, that knowledge of your job, your ability to understand and process information and make a decision? That's that intellectual component of fighting power. Now, as I said, the physical component is largely given to you through training. The moral component is largely given to you through experience. So the experience of being an infantryman, an armored corps soldier, etc. The experience that you have of trusting your superiors because you've seen during training that they make the right decisions. And the intellectual component is largely given to you through education. So if we look at that, and if we call it a professional development trinity, you can see on this slide that the all-corps officer and soldier training continuums, trade training, specialist to arms courses, etc., that's part of that training, that part of that physical component of fighting power. You can see under experience, the different postings you get. If you are seconded, if you go overseas and do international engagement, that's all part of your experiential learning, your time in rank, okay? And then education, we have things such as optional short courses, languages, professional military education, etc. Now, I would wager if you look at that and you pause and look at that trinity, most of what you do every day probably falls into that top circle. Most of what you have done throughout your career probably falls into that top circle. What we want is to create an army where you as an individual, every single one of you, falls into that middle bit where they all overlap. Where we develop you through your training, your experience, and your education so that you can have that intellectual overmatch on any adversary that you will meet. So we've created a model. How are we going to do this? We've created a framework for understanding this. So, unless you happen to live in a blue police phone box, okay, Time is a linear concept. All right? Time starts and goes on throughout a number of seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, etc. So does experience. Okay, so you can't really fast forward experience. You can learn from others' mistakes. There are things you can do to gain greater experience, but you still develop your experience in a linear manner. So throughout your career, you will see that experience itself is a linear process. And largely that experience comes through your postings, your deployments, secondments, etc. All right? Now the levers for that are owned by the career management agency. They're the guys who post you, guys and girls who post you, who give you those, who find the op nominations, etc. Largely that experience for you guys here, for the majority of you, will be schema or DOCM. So that experience will go throughout your Army career. You will then receive, in time, little slices of training. Okay, so you will start off, you went through ARTC, that was a period of time in your experience that you received your basic training. You then went off and did IATs. Then at some point you will have gone on to do Junior Leaders course or Subject 1 for Corporal, then Subject 2 for Corporal, and you progress through that individual training of the all-corps officer and soldier training continuum. And they are slithers in time that build with your experience, but those are slithers of training. And we are really, really good at recording that, developing it, delivering it. We're transforming how we do that, but that's really our DNA. And we capture it, and you all get course reports, etc., etc. We also have collective training. So when you go on a kata, or when you've just been out doing platoon live firing attacks, that is part of your collective training. We also do international engagement training. Okay? So whilst we do that collectively, what we're less good at doing is recording that sort of collective training experience. All right? But it still slithers in time where you are developing your physical component of fighting power. So what we've got at the moment is we've got your experience, and then in slithers of time, we've got training. Now what we want to do, and what this framework, the purpose of this framework is to offer to everyone in Army, regardless of where they are in their career, is the ability to access education which will make them better in their job and in future jobs. This is about complementing that physical component of fighting power of training and the experience you will automatically get throughout your career, which is part of the moral component, and now we're going to give you the intellectual component. And this is what we're proposing to Army, and this is what we want your feedback on. So the education you will see in the model can be accessed at any point in your career. That's one of the key founding principles of it. It should be education that you are in control of accessing. Okay? It shouldn't be tied down to now you will do this block of education at this point in your career, because you will all have different careers. The one-size-fits-all model doesn't really work for education. What a craftsman in the RAMI might need, or an EW specialist within signals might need, is very different from what an infantryman might need, etc. So we want to look at how can we provide that education to you throughout your career. Now, we've broken it down into 5 categories, and I'm going to go through each one in a little bit. So firstly, the art and science of thinking. This is about how do you take in and process information and make a decision. Okay, so how do you understand the environment? If we're saying that our defining ability to defeat an enemy, one of the key things that we want to develop to defeat an enemy is our intellectual edge, our intellectual overmatch on the enemy, then surely we should be thinking about how do we think better. Okay, so one of the things I want you to think about is, okay, what would you want to know? What education would you like to receive on how to think better? Okay, do you want to receive stuff on understanding evidence-based decision-making so that you're not making it shooting from the hip and just going from gut feel? Do you want to understand more about how to access resources? how to read through big documents and bring out the facts, how to make decision-making under stress, okay? So these are some of the things that would go into the art and science of thinking. We then got the art and science of war, and this is really what we kind of consider PME to be at the moment, okay? So how do we use those tactics, lessons from history to make us better able to do our job? Okay, so CHOOT series, looking at historical battles, pulling lessons out to make us better at tactics, better at operations, better at campaign planning, depending on where you sit within the army. The third one is leadership, ethics, and society. So leadership is key to us as an army and what we do. So how do we improve the leadership within ourselves? How can we develop our own leadership? Next is ethics. One of the key things that sets us out from many of our adversaries, be they state or non-state, current or future, is the ethical base and the ethical decision-making which we use when we apply force. Okay? How do we reinforce that? What lessons would you like to be able to pull out, to look at, to develop your own ethical understanding? And society, and this is really important, both for Australian society, where do we fit as a part of Australian society within a liberal democracy? Should we include some topics on how the Australian government actually works? How do laws get made? And also, how do we look at other societies? Because we live in a part of the world where throughout Southeast Asia, societies are very different from each other. If we are to successfully work with them as partners and operate within those societies, we must understand them. Now, we've done quite well at understanding some of the societies in the Middle East. Should we be broadening that? And part of that is languages. Okay? How do we as a defence force allow you, the soldiers of the defence force, to improve your language skills with other countries? Okay? Does the current model fit? Science, technology, engineering and mathematics, often known as STEM. Okay, you've probably all heard of that coming out of education establishments, etc. This is about how do we provide the STEM subjects for you to future-proof yourself for those technologies which will be brought into service. So you remember I spoke about the sine wave of technologies that will come in? How do we make you as the Army's people, how do we bring that future towards us and make sure that you have the understanding to be able to do your job in the future? If you're going off to do a BCCC, for example, you're going to do your basic communication course, would doing a short package or being able to access a short package on how radios actually work and radio waves and propagation, would that set you up as a STEM subject to be able to do better on BCCC? As one example. Have you come to the Army and you realise that actually you think your mathematics is probably a bit lower? I've just been doing a heavily mathematical course, and I've realised that my mathematics are probably not where they should be. Particularly when the first equations I saw were mainly letters, not numbers, and I always thought maths was about numbers. So how do we access those STEM subjects which allow us to be able to improve ourselves and be ready for that next technology? Pulling the future towards us. And the last one is pretty important. So we always think that, and we all joined the Army just like you did. I joined the Army because we were going to go out and we were going to be soldiers and we were going to be in the field and we're all going to be part of a combat or a combat support arm, and it was all about delivering capability in the field. And then you actually join and you realise that it's not all about being out in the field. And it's not all about being out in a combat or combat support or service support delivery mechanism. The Army is a large organisation. So how do we prepare people for those subsequent roles where they're involved in projects or managing people? How do we provide human resources training for people before they go off to DOCOM or Schema, to the Career Management Agency, for example? How do we provide people with the ability to work on projects? So these are the 5 levels of education that we're looking at. And what we want to do is create short courses that you can access at any point in your career through blended learning to be able to upskill yourself, to develop your own intellectual edge in an area which suits you at that time, at that point in your career, to make you better for the future. So how do we win the next war? I would argue that we're not going to do it through purely technological superiority, and we're not going to do it through mass. We're going to do it through creating an intellectual edge which gives us that relative superiority in time and place to achieve an effect against an adversary, and we then recock and do it again. And we do that at being better at thinking than them. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we now pass on to the questions part. Does anyone have any questions?
Lieutenant Hancock, 7RAR. So at this stage in the plan for this intellectual edge, is this looking at expanding, say, the current campus course module? Is that where you're looking at progressing this?
That's a great question. So we'll probably look at ADEL being the platform that we utilize. That's had a lot of success since its introduction, and we want to reinforce that success. What we will probably do is partner with certain tertiary education institutions or people from within those institutions to develop these packages so that over time we have a library of packages across those 5 lines that people can then access when they do. We're looking at sort of the mini MOOC type model where someone can access, there'll be some videos for you to watch, there'll be some readings to read. If we can bring in some sort of online forum so you can discuss with other people doing that course, that's still all very much in the embryonic stage. What I'm really looking for now from you and from the wider Army is what are those topics that you want? What would you like those courses to be? What are the courses that you think you would like to see that you could access through ADEL or through another system at any point in your career to be able to build your intellectual capability? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much. It's been great to be here down at Adelaide. For those of you watching at the outstations, thank you very much for joining us here at the Cove. Hopefully that has given you some idea of some of the work which is being done to improve the intellectual component of fighting power within the Australian Army. We will try and get Dr. Matthews back to talk to us at a later date about Islamic State, and he sends his apologies for not being here. But there's an open invitation now to you, the members of the Army, to email us at soldiercove@gmail.com with your ideas and suggestions of the topics and the modules that you would like to see brought in as part of the trial of this framework for professional development across Army. Let us know which areas you think we should be concentrating in, and that will then allow us to start developing the curriculum so that we can develop those modules for a trial, hopefully later this year. Thank you very much for joining us here at the Cove, the home of the Australian Profession of Arms, for today's Cove Talk. We look forward to seeing you. At the moment, the next Cove Talk is likely to be from Commander Forces Command, who will give a talk to all the Forces Command units and then be able to answer a question and answer. Details on time and location will follow on in due course. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.